You opened the box on the kitchen table, and there were hundreds of parts inside. Resistors in little plastic bags sorted by color bands, capacitors lined up by value, vacuum tubes in cardboard sleeves with numbers printed on the glass, a chassis with holes already punched, a transformer heavier than a brick, a roll of solder, and the manual, the Heathkit manual. You did not know it yet, but that manual was about to teach you more about how the world worked than 4 years of high school ever would. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Every Heathkit began with the catalog. It arrived in the mail in a brown envelope, and it was thick and glossy and organized by category. Test equipment, ham radio, stereo amplifiers, color televisions, computers, robots. You sat at the kitchen table and turned the pages slowly and dog-eared the corners of the kits you wanted. You showed your father and he looked at the prices and said maybe for Christmas. The catalog was not a catalog, it was a promise. Every page said you can build this. You, not an engineer, not a technician, you, a 15-year-old boy with no training and a soldering iron he got for his birthday. You can build a working oscilloscope. You can build a stereo amplifier that will sound better than anything in the store. You can build a ham radio transmitter that will reach Australia. And the crazy part is they were right. You could, and you did. The kitchen table. This is where it happened, not in a lab, but on the kitchen table after dinner. While your mother was doing the dishes, your sister was doing homework, and your father was reading the paper in the living room. You spread the manual open, laid the parts, and commandeered every muffin pan and small dish in the kitchen to hold the dozens of resistors, capacitors, screws, and washers that came in the kit. The soldering iron cord was never long enough. It stretched from the outlet behind the toaster to the edge of the table. Your brother tripped over it twice and left burn marks on the linoleum. Your mother said, "When will you finish that thing and clean up this mess?" And you said, "Tomorrow." And tomorrow came and the mess was bigger. The estimated completion times on the box were a fantasy. The kit that said 8 hours took you 3 weekends, but nobody rushed you and nobody told you to stop. Your mother complained about the mess, but she never told you to put it away. She knew something was happening at that table that mattered more than a clean kitchen. The manual, the Heathkit manual, was the single finest piece of technical writing ever produced in the United States. It began with a lesson on how to solder, not the kit, not the circuit, how to hold the iron, how to tin the tip, how to heat the joint and let the solder flow, how to recognize a good connection, and how to fix a bad one. Before you touched a single component, you learned the one skill that everything else depended on. Then the manual walked you through every step, one at a time. Each step had a checkbox next to it that you marked with a pencil when you finished. Each step had a diagram that folded out so you could see it while you read the instructions on the other page. The diagrams showed the circuit from your viewpoint, not the engineer's viewpoint. Yours, as if you were looking down at the chassis in front of you with the parts in your hand. Heathkit's slogan was, "We will not let you fail," and they meant it. The manual would not let you fail if you followed it. One step at a time, one checkbox at a time, one solder joint at a time. When you got to the last page and the last checkbox and the last step, you had built something real with your own hands, and you understood every single part of how it worked because the manual had explained it along the way. The smell, rosin core solder. If you have built a Heathkit, you know the smell, and if you have not, there is no way to describe it. Sweet and acrid at the same time. A thin wisp of smoke rising from the tip of the iron every time the solder melted and flowed into a joint. It hung in the air over the kitchen table like incense. It got into your clothes and your hair, and your mother could smell it on you when you came down for breakfast the next morning. Years later, you would walk into an electronics shop or a repair bench and catch that smell, and for a second you were 15 again, sitting at the kitchen table with the manual open and the iron hot, and 643 steps between you and a working stereo amplifier. The smell of solder is the smell of patience, the smell of concentration, the smell of becoming someone who could build things with his hands, the moment of truth, the last step. You plugged it in, you backed away, you were sure it was going to explode. You had spent 3 weekends and 40 hours soldering hundreds of connections, installing dozens of components, tightening scores of screws, and checking each one off in the manual. And now the moment had come, and you were standing 4 feet from the kitchen table with your hand on the wall switch and your heart in your throat. You flipped the switch, and nothing exploded. The pilot light came on, the transformer hummed, and if it was a tube kit, the vacuum tubes began to glow. A warm orange light through the ventilation slots in the chassis. One tube, then another, then all of them, glowing like tiny campfires inside glass bottles, and the dial lit up, and the needle moved, and the machine you had built from a box of parts on the kitchen table was alive and working, and you had done it yourself. You stood there looking at it with a feeling you had never had before. Not pride exactly, something deeper than pride, proof that you could understand something complex, execute it correctly, and make it work. It showed that your hands and your brain could do something together that neither could do alone. Heathkit gave you that. No school ever did. The color television. Your father bought it. The kit, not the TV. He brought the box home and set it on the floor of the living room and said, "This is our new television, and you are going to build it." The box was 3 feet long and weighed 50 pounds. Inside were hundreds of components and a picture tube the size of a basketball and a manual that was 2 inches thick. You were 16. You worked on it every evening for a month. You built the power supply first, then the deflection circuits, then the tuner, then the video amplifier, then the color decoder. Each section was a kit within a kit. Each section had its own test procedure so you could verify it worked before moving on. And when you connected the picture tube and turned it on for the first time, and Walter Cronkite appeared on the screen in color in your living room, your father stood behind you, put his hand on your shoulder and said, "Good job." Your family watched that television for 10 years. Every time someone asked where you got it, you said, "I built it." 2 words that meant everything. I built it. Not I bought it, I built it. And every guest who heard that looked at the 16-year-old kid, then looked at the television and did not fully believe it until your father confirmed it. He built it. The ham radio. If you were a Heathkit builder and you were a ham radio operator, the HW101 was your radio. They called it the Hot Water 101. It was a high-frequency transceiver that could talk to the world. You built it on the kitchen table, and then you carried it to your bedroom or the basement or the spare room your parents let you use. You connected it to an antenna you had strung between the chimney and the oak tree in the backyard. You turned it on, you put the headphones on, and you heard voices from places you had never been: Australia, Japan, Germany, Brazil, a man in Buenos Aires calling CQ. You answered him. He answered you back. Your voice traveled through the air on a radio you had built with your own hands from a box of parts on the kitchen table and reached a stranger 10,000 miles away. That is what Heathkit made possible. Not just the radio, the connection, the reach, the proof that a boy in Ohio could talk to a man in Argentina because he built something that worked. Howard Anthony. You should know who he was. He bought a bankrupt airplane company in 1935 and moved it to Benton Harbor, Michigan. He ran it as an aircraft parts business through the war. After the war, he bid on a lot of surplus military electronic parts at auction. The story goes that he had forgotten about the bid when the station master called and said, "Mr. Anthony, you have 4 or 5 railroad cars filled with electronic parts, and you have 1 week before the storage fees start." He scrambled. He found a pile of surplus cathode ray tubes in the shipment. He copied an oscilloscope design from a magazine and packaged it as a kit for $39.50. That was half the price of a factory-built oscilloscope. He mailed 500 flyers. 350 orders came back. The kit business was born from a forgotten bid and a pile of surplus tubes in a railroad car in Benton Harbor, Michigan. In 1954, Howard Anthony was killed in a plane crash. He was the second head of the company to die that way. But by then, the company he had accidentally started had already changed the lives of millions of boys who would grow up to be engineers because a man forgot he bid on 5 boxcars of surplus parts. The career. This is what nobody talks about. Heathkit did not just sell electronic kits. Heathkit created engineers. The boy who built the oscilloscope at 15 went to college and studied electrical engineering because he already knew what a capacitor did, how a transformer worked, and what happened when you applied voltage to a vacuum tube. He knew because he had done it with his own hands at the kitchen table. The boy who built the stereo amplifier became an audio engineer. The boy who built the ham radio became a communications specialist. The boy who built the color television went to work for RCA, Zenith, or Motorola. When they asked him in the interview what experience he had, he said that he built a Heathkit color television when he was 16, and the interviewer hired him on the spot because he knew that a kid who could build a Heathkit TV could build anything. Heathkit was not a hobby. Heathkit was a vocational school disguised as a catalog. It taught more Americans how electronics worked than every university in the country combined. And it did it for $39.50 at a time. The store. Heathkit had stores, actual physical locations where you could walk in and see every kit assembled and working. The oscilloscope was on a bench and you could turn the dials. The stereo amplifier was connected to speakers and you could hear how it sounded. The ham radio was on a table with headphones and you could listen to the bands. A man behind the counter knew every kit by model number and he could tell you which one matched your skill level and which one you should wait another year before attempting. The Heathkit store was not a store. It was a museum of things you could build. You walked through it slowly, touching the chassis and looking at the wiring through the ventilation slots, and you thought I could do that. That is the wiring I would do. Those are the solder joints I would make. And you were right, you could. And when those stores closed in the early 1990s, the last place where a boy could stand in front of a working machine and believe he could build one disappeared with them. The sun. Here is what Heathkit did that no one expected. It created fathers who taught sons. The boy who built the oscilloscope in 1962 grew up and had a son in 1978, and when that son turned 12, the father went to the catalog and ordered a kit and put the box on the kitchen table and said, "Let us build this together." Not because the son needed a radio or a clock or a voltmeter, because the father wanted to give his son the same thing he had been given. The experience of following a manual and soldering a joint and checking a box and building something that worked. The father already knew how. He did not need the manual, but he let his son hold the iron. He let his son read the steps. He let his son make the mistakes and then showed him how to fix them the way his own father had sat at the table with him 20 years earlier and said nothing while the solder flowed. Heathkit was not passed down like a toy. It was passed down like a trade. Father to son, the language of building. Then the world changed. Electronics got smaller. The vacuum tubes that glowed orange and told you the machine was alive were replaced by transistors you could barely see. The transistors were replaced by integrated circuits that packed 1,000,000 components onto a chip the size of your fingernail. You could not solder a chip the size of your fingernail with a kitchen table soldering iron. The very technology that made electronics better made them impossible to build yourself. And then the kits stopped at being cheaper. By the mid-1980s, a factory-built computer from Japan cost less than the Heathkit version and came already assembled. The whole reason to build a kit, saving money while learning how it worked, evaporated in a single decade. People wanted instant gratification. They wanted to open the box and use it. They did not want to spend 3 weekends at the kitchen table. The company stopped developing new kits in 1986. The line was discontinued in 1991. The New York Times ran the story on the front page because they understood that something important had ended. Not a company, an ERA. It was the era when you could open the back of anything electronic and see the tubes, trace the wires, and understand how the signal traveled from the antenna to the speaker. That era is over. Today, the back panel says no user-serviceable parts inside. Heathkit was entirely user-serviceable parts. That was the whole point. Your Heathkit is still somewhere, in the basement, in the attic, at a hamfest, on a shelf in the garage next to the paint cans. The stereo amplifier you built when you were 17 might still work. The oscilloscope might still trace a waveform. The ham radio might still receive if you connected an antenna, because you built it right. You followed the manual, you checked every box, you soldered every joint. The machine you made does not know that 40 years have passed. It does not know that the company is gone. It does not know that the kitchen table where you built it has been replaced twice. It only knows that you put it together correctly and it still works, and it will keep working until the last tube burns out or the last capacitor dries up, and even then you could fix it. Because you built it. You know where every part goes. You have the manual. If you built a Heathkit, tell me what it was. If you built the color television, tell me how long it took. If the HW101 was your first radio, tell me who you talked to. If your mother asked when you would finish that thing and clean up this mess, tell me what year it was. And if that kit is still in your basement and it still works, and you turned it on last month just to hear the transformer hum and watch the tubes glow, tell me what it felt like. I read every single comment.